algorithms are going. We know that right now we're all hurting a little bit under COVID, that people are watching MSNBC and CNN, and that it's weighted, that the algorithms are weighted towards them. So there's even more importance, it's even more important that Bernie and AOC and other leaders don't take us for granted, because we are the ones that are going to make sure that base turns out. And it is a little self-serving in some ways, but
it's just the truth. It's just the truth. You need to look, and Nomiki and I will refine our Chris Matthews impressions. Like, come on, AOC, be a guest on our show.
I got the Rachel Maddow.
Yeah. We need more guests on YouTube. But seriously, like it is ridiculous that they don't see and don't act on the same need that the right frankly does. And it's
there's definitely, I think, more liability. Go ahead, Jamie.
Don't you think that everybody who's watching alternative media is already going to go out and vote for Bernie, though? Like, no?
They aren't.
It seems to me.
I think everybody that's watching the right-wing media is going to have a likelihood of voting for Trump. But the point is cultivating it and amplifying power and building an alternative hegemonic base in media to the extent that's possible. Politicians need to be a part of that.
What they're saying is not that Bernie shouldn't come on our shows for the sake of Bernie, that Bernie should come on our shows for the sake of us, that will ultimately get big enough to bring people, so Bernie goes on Joe Rogan. And I mean, this was part of the criticism that I think, that people missed, is that it is elevating Joe Rogan. Joe Rogan has a huge show, but now, I mean, look, Mark Maron had a huge show, WTF. All right, just use this example, and not a political show. And he had Barack Obama on, and it didn't in any way, it was not a political conversation in any way. But then Mark Maron is in the canon with Terry what's-her-face, and it elevated Maron. To have a political candidate go on Joe Rogan, it elevates Joe Rogan. Now, I happen to think that it was a worthwhile thing to do, because you're out there, you're trying to reach other people. But the idea is that the politicians, the argument is, as I understand it, is the politicians need to be giving the independent media some of their cachet to build up that independent media, so that when you need a cavalry, we're there.
That's right.
And we are the cavalry, and and that's what we're dealing with.
I will also say this. There is a double standard for the left and for us. Like, you don't hear the only person who, would talk about how Congressman called into Rush Limbaugh to apologize for saying something that Limbaugh criticized. And they've been doing this for decades. They would call in and literally, Rush, I just want to say I'm sorry. I think I was wrong, and maybe you misinterpreted something, but I'm not saying you really misinterpreted what I said. I just think that I was wrong. And I just want you to know and that gets no coverage, except for on on Air America, let's say. Whereas had Bernie called into Chapo and said, listen, guys, I'm sorry. I should not have had that. That would have been.
I should have used more snake emojis, and I apologize.
Front page story. And so there's more liability. There's a greater liability involved in that for these candidates.
Right.
Than there is on the right.
And it becomes a Bernie Sanders, he says something 4 months later and it's connected to Bernie Sanders. But with that being said, I also think that we are the vehicles for the message for the movement. The movement has not known what to do in the last few months. We're like, wait, where are we going? Even though Bernie's own campaign had mixed messages. So if you have your media, your aligned media working with you, if you're going on there and having different types of conversations than you'd have on Rachel Maddow, because when he goes on Rachel Maddow, he's on defense. But when he's on our show, we can loosen up and talk about the future, talk about what's, coming up, how people can organize on the ground. And I think he tried to do that with his own platform, but, I understand he wanted to get the message out to the campaign through the podcast, but there's more to that. And as somebody, Bernie did have his own channel at one point when, it was in the 80s or something, or the 90s. He should understand more than anybody what it takes to build this infrastructure. I think that Ro Khan is good at this, by the way.
All of our shows. Let's just be blunt. No, I mean, honestly, because there is that asymmetry between I like the cavalry imagery a lot. Like, you have to feed that. And Rush, I also wonder, like, Rush was such an extreme, like, literally dedicating, like, dictating policy almost, right? But we remember, we used to joke about it, like, great clips of Trump being on, like, well, Bubba, that's a great point. And he would just be on with some, like, random dude named Bubba in Alabama. And guess what? Bubba's got, like, 30,000 people that not only will vote a certain way, but they'll deliver the message, they'll cultivate in their communities. You have to feed that. And it's crazy not to.
Okay. As much as I like that idea because it would probably benefit me personally, I just don't see. Oh my God, stop it. Sorry, my cat's scratching the chair. Fun working from home. I just don't know that alternative media has the potential to become as influential and wide-reaching as corporate media. It's a behemoth in this country. Maybe if we're talking about a decades-long project, it's obviously important, but I think we might get more bang for our buck trying to spread the message, trying to build power in other ways, because most people are not radicalized by listening to a podcast. I'm weird that I got radicalized by hearing ideas. Although, experiences as well played a role. Most people get radicalized by engaging in struggle in their own lives. And that's why it's the most important thing right now for the organized left, the socialist left, to be involving itself in every single working class struggle with and as the working class, to try to regrow that bond, bridge the gap between the organized left and the wider working class that's become such a big gulf in the past few decades. And I think that's the only way that political consciousness is really going to spread.
I would also say that I don't think that it works the same on the left as it does on the right. I'm speaking broadly in terms of the value of having politicians on, because you can ask Amy Goodman, really. Yeah. As an example. The fact is that it helped Marin to have Barack Obama on the program, but he didn't do anything with it from a political perspective. It certainly built his profile. It helped his business, but Amy Goodman, when she had Bill Clinton on and put the screws on him, basically it was over at that point.
Well, how that interview happened, right, Sam?
What's that?
You know how that happened, though, right?
It was, I think it was more or less a fluke on some level.
No, that wasn't a booked interview. This is a completely different time. He was literally calling random local New York stations to get out the vote for Gore and Clinton, his wife, in 2000. Just happened to call WBAI, and to her credit,
she took advantage of it.
She used it to just... But that was a very different dynamic.
No, but I'm saying, but my point is this: is that, like, if you're going to have politicians on these shows, and you can either go at them, or not, but you're going for the idea that these politicians can go on these shows, raise the profile of the shows, but also then not have a liability and be in the same sort of, like, give them the same value on the right. I just don't think that analogy works in the same way. I just don't think that
they give a pass to the right.
Yeah, of course. And we all know that. Yeah. But
definitely. I'm saying, but that's why it works for them, because it's the same type of circle jerk that you see with, like, Sam Harris comes on to Shapiro's show and Rubin's show, and it's just a circle jerk. And unless you do the circle jerk, it is not going to have the same effect, and it's not going to be sustainable. But the circle jerk sort of undercuts the notion of independence.
With that being said, it is interesting that there isn't more recognition of, I think some people, I think Ro Khanna has been extremely good at this. He called into my Sirius XM show 2.5 years ago, and we had a vocal debate because I forgot what issue we disagreed on Twitter. It was before he became this, well-known leftist. But he goes on all the left media and he recognizes that it's important to have those relationships. But for the most part, it is important that our base shows up, because out of all the bases in the electorate, it's the left younger base that does not have the history of showing up to every election, versus the Republican base, which watches these shows, which listens to these radio shows, which almost always show up. And yet they still give them the attention that they demand, partly because I think that they just understand power a little bit more in the Republican institutions.
Because those radio people, they actually wield power.
Right.
For all we can say about the whatever, we can have 60, 70,000 people watch this video today, and a couple of 10,000 more watch it on or listen to it or stream it other places and whatnot. But that's nothing compared to what Mark Levin can mobilize, what Laura Ingraham can mobilize on radio. Or Limbaugh.
I want to push back just a little bit on that, because in 2017, if there hadn't been, frankly, a TYT, the only coverage of the IDC in New York was through TYT for 6 months, and it brought activists involved. I can't tell you, I still get messages from people. And AOC did not get any money until TYT and Ryan Grimm reported on AOC, and then her video went viral.
I'm not saying that it has no power, but I'm saying that in 2005, when George Bush tried to push immigration reform, it was radio hosts around the country, maybe a half dozen of them, who were able to mobilize millions of people. Yes, there's no doubt that you can, we can get some money to candidates. We can get a couple hundred volunteers to go to certain areas if we, a concerted effort. Certainly TYT has that ability because they have such an audience. But the scale is radically different.
Yeah.
In California, right-wing talk radio got Gray Davis, did recalls. We don't have that type of media power, and it's not going to happen until the technology radically changes and the structures of it change.
But is that because they're older? Their listeners are prime voters. Our listeners are not prime voters.
Well, but our listeners, we still don't have those numbers. We just don't have those numbers.
I think you're totally
right. First of all, we're also living a different media age where the media is far more fractured than it was even 10, 15 years ago.
But it's just, in some respects, though, I think that last point's really big. I don't know if that type of scale is ever going to be replicated.
Right.
I think we have to really get used to being in a radically, I think even mass cultural products that everybody tunes into, like the NFL, are dissipating, let alone in political talk. But I also think, the only way of building some scale is building scale. And there's even just a basic, I think even the points we just made, with AOC or the IDC, there's a certain just political reciprocity dynamic as well. You should give energy back to those that gave you energy, and it will continue to help and be mutually beneficial. It's not that hard to figure out, and it shouldn't be an exception on the left. And of course, there's no contradiction between that and the broader stuff that Jamie's talking about. But I think the idea of the whole market being fragmented is probably a whole other and maybe even more relevant conversation, because I don't think anything's going to come to scale that.
Let's take some calls. I don't know if we're going to get to some of these video clips that I want to talk to about, but maybe we will. Because the Trump was in rare form yesterday, and also, tough day to slam Joe Biden for a lack of leadership, but this was pretty pretty egregious in my mind. But let's go to the phones. Calling from a 608 area code. Who's this? Where are you calling from?